What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Iron Culture. It is me, Eric Trexler, here with the Dr. Eric Helms. Helms, how are we doing tonight?
I'm doing so well. Last couple times we've had Iron Culture episodes, you haven't been here. There was so much talk about me not being around kind of last year, yet pot kettle black. What's going on? I'm rolling up with Connor Heffernan, and also the revived stronger man himself, Steve Hall. And I just wondered, do I need to send them applications or announce expression of interest for an alternative host? Because they both have a lot of experience hosting generally, having me on. Like Connor is technically a bit of a host. He's in the forthcoming Iron Culture documentary. You are not. I just want to know, are you still about that life?
I am indeed, and the fact that they have been on the show gives me a lot of confidence they will not wish to host it. I think usually people have a pretty unpleasant experience when it's just one-on-one with Helms, so I feel pretty confident, pretty safe with my placement here. As committed as ever to the culture, but as we know from time to time, sometimes you just have to put your toes in the sand, get a little cocktail beverage with some fruit in it, a little umbrella sticking out of it. And actually, I don't even really remember why I was gone. Nothing interesting or exciting happened. I did not have a tropical beach vacation. But nonetheless, I am back, and it is unseasonably cold where I live. So it is a double whammy of reality crushing me in the face.
First, touche, well played. I was hopeful that maybe you had actually taken a vacation, but knowing both you and myself, that probably didn't happen. In fact, someone asked me recently about the vacation I took for my wife and I's 20th anniversary. And they're like, "Oh, that was great. How often do you guys get away?" And I was like, "Oh, we did for our 10th anniversary." And
Yeah.
they were like, "So a decade ago was the last time you took a vacation that was just a vacation for vacation's sake, not tacking on a couple days after a conference, or, oh, you got some data collection over here, babe. Well, let's also go to Paris first, for a day." So, no, I get it. And in all seriousness, it's good to be back. It's glad to have you back, and I'm really excited for 2026, man.
Oh yeah, big year ahead. Although we are probably approaching that limit where you can't talk about the new year anymore. It's February 9th, so I think this is probably it for us. So this is the last time we'll acknowledge what year it is until we get to probably Thanksgiving, and we'll start to say, "Hey, 2026, whatever you were going to do, you better wrap it up." Okay, so, but we are here squarely in the new year and ready for another big push. Now, before Helms, we get into anything related to our 2026 offering of materials. First, we have to give a big shout out to our dear friends at Elite FTS. EliteFTS.com, your place to go if you need any gym gear, if you need any gym apparel, high quality stuff. I use it myself. I've been using it since approximately like 2010-ish, 2011-ish. And the problem is you buy a pair of straps, they last forever and you'll never come back, which we need to talk to Dave. That's not a smart business model. But I can vouch for the durability for sure. So if you go to EliteFTS.com, you use our code MRR10, you will get a 10% discount off most things in the store. Now, if you want to support us, in addition to our friends, and I mean, support is not a zero-sum game. You can dole out as much as you wish. You can support us in many ways. You certainly always like, rate, subscribe, and review the show on YouTube, on whatever podcast platform you happen to utilize. That's always a good idea. You definitely want to do that. In addition, you could, what else could they do, Holmes? They could certainly check out the Mass Research Review. I mean, that's the best thing you could do. Head over to massresearchreview.com and check out our offerings there. The Mass Research Review was established in 2017, never missed an issue, never been late on an issue, every single month, the first of the month, in your inbox. Whether you like viewing it on the app, whether you like viewing it on web, whether you like viewing it as a PDF that you can even print and bind, which people have done. I have interacted with actual pages of the Mass Research Review. Every month, a huge update, usually 80, 90, 100 pages worth of really solid practical information about the newest research in exercise, nutrition, health, fitness, and all adjacent topics. Helms, what am I missing? Anything else we need to promote?
Yeah. Do you like it in Espanol? Because
Ooh.
we got that too, you know?
And that's actually a lot of people are telling me that that is actually their approach to linguistic immersion. Is that instead of like taking a semester abroad and living in Madrid, they are just hammering their way through every issue of Spanish Mass as a person who doesn't speak Spanish, which honestly, no one's doing that. I'm going to come clean. I made that up. I've never heard of a person doing that. But honestly, it'd be really cool if somebody did. Uh,
It would
it's
be
probably
very
the
cool.
worst way you could possibly learn a language, but maybe you needed that piece of motivation to help you learn Spanish. Wouldn't you feel so much more accomplished if you read through the Mass catalog in Spanish as your cherry on top of learning this new language?
No, I think it's a great way to go. And on top of that, I'll just say from a personally very selfish financial perspective, Muslim Strength Pyramids, which did come out at the end of last year, we have now got our Italian, Spanish, Chinese translators on board. They are currently working on the next iteration of the Muslim Strength Pyramid. So those are probably going to get launched this year, 2026. So for those who are interested in getting rid of Duolingo, and learning Spanish via Mass and the pyramids, as well as Italian and potentially Chinese. We have the worst method of learning a language, but the best translations of our work into those languages, if I'm going to be just as honest as Trex was.
Beautiful. We're all about honesty. It's okay if you lie first, as long as you come clean in the same breath. You know, I don't, there's a certain like statute of limitations there. If you lie and then immediately come clean, I think it's basically as good as telling the truth. So, Helms, we have a beautiful show lined up, and this is a rare, essentially like a bit of a continuation or, you know, a kind of, yeah, I'm trying to think of the way to phrase it here, but we are going to approach topics that you discussed on the last episode with Steve Hall, and then we are going to take a deep dive into the literature on that topic. So if you want to go ahead and set the stage, and this will be helpful because I'm sure there's going to be some people who have not yet listened to the last episode, so we can give people an idea of what that's all about, and then dive into the fresh material.
Absolutely. So for those who missed our crossover episode, which is still a podcast name that is being workshopped, whether that is Iron Stronger, Revive Culture, some combination thereof, all of the above, whatever you choose, dealer's choice.
Some
We had a
kind of
really good
we could
chat.
make some kind of like revival cult, but then
Yeah,
it'll sound like an even more serious cult, and we might start getting on some lists of intelligence agencies.
we're probably already there based upon some of the comments I've made in the current administration. And if not, we are now because of what I just said about the current administration.
And here we go. We're gonna get more comments about Helms getting all political. So
Well, we had a whole episode where we lambasted the new dietary guidelines for Americans. So if, you know,
I don't think we
I'm
did though. I think we lambasted the way they were communicated, but like we said like the protein is solid, like that's a neutral to positive change. The alcohol is actually as written better than it used to be, although as rolled out kind of a flub. But that was a press conference flub, right? So I personally don't think it was particularly divisive in terms of the political element.
I took shots at the second committee and
Yeah,
its lack of transparency. And I
that's
mean, if
true.
this is an administration that's forming second committees to talk about fruits and vegetables, what's to stop them from forming additional arms of the federal government to stop podcasters from saying the things that need to be said? I'm going to keep speaking truth to power, but I know we're going to get shut down, and that's just what it is. If you see me get pulled off camera, it's probably because they sent the new enforcement arm of the second committee for the dietary guidelines in America to New Zealand and actually started a world war across the world with Oceania. So
Yeah, because
unfortunate that's happening, but we're not going to stop.
yeah, it always reminds me like when you hear people say when they're arguing in good faith and they're like, you know, it's a really slippery slope. And it's like, you know, you just quoted a logical fallacy in your defense of your logic. But in your case, Helms, that slippery slope seems very enticing, and I'm sure it's probably gonna come to fruition.
100%.
Yeah.
So anyway, in that episode with Steve, we started with congratulating each other for about 30 minutes And then we had a really self-indulgent dive into my history, where I actually did talk a bit about neurodivergence and my personal experiences and where I am at. And I'm on actually still the cusp of a potential diagnosis there. And I decided to disclose that because I think it's important to understand what what we see in as coaches and as athletes sometimes in strength sport and in physique sport, because I think there is probably an overrepresentation of certain types of brains, if you will. If you like the monotony of powerlifting, or if you really, really crave the structure of bodybuilding or the nutritional side of it. But also, we got into how there are elements of special interests and hyperfocus and some of these traits that can cross-pollinate across some various different types of neurodiversity. And one of the things that I talked about was how naive I was when I first got into the quote unquote social media game as a science communicator, and how some of the Gen 1 science communicators I found had some, like a higher, seemingly an overrepresentation of narcissistic traits, and how their egos sometimes took a front seat to perhaps altruism and their desire to actually, educate people. And how it can be very depressing to see how things go online. And I talked about how important it is to not let your heroes become gurus. And Steve specifically asked me, like, how do you deal with it when people put you up on a pedestal and treat you like you're infallible? And we had a good chat about that. And I talked about how the visible falls from grace that we can think of some that are happening right now, but frankly, I've been in the game long enough. It's just like a 50% roll of the dice likelihood outcome for anyone who is online perpetually and popular, even if they're evidence-based. Yeah. That they're going to prove themselves to be who they've been the whole time, and they happen to be a pretty shitty person. And I think that can really make people think that the fitness industry as a whole is a really, really terrible place. But I do think online is a really oddly skewed representation of who that is, because you hang out with a bunch of personal trainers. If you hang out at a gym, just with a bunch of people, if you hang out in the bodybuilding community, the powerlifting community, they are overwhelmingly positive places full of people who are trying to do good work and are living their passions and trying to help other people live healthier, happier lives. I mean, if you think about it, like, you decided that you wanted to make exercise and health and nutrition your profession. So why is it the online space seems terrible? Maybe it has a little more to do with the online side of things than it being evidence-based or fitness or anything like that. And, I shared how that naivete really surprised me. And my recommendation to people was to be like, hey, don't put anyone too far up on a pedestal, because you can get the sense of it poisoning the well. And we've seen this lashback where, because of the content or the type of person and their fall from grace, it's negatively impacted kind of what they represent, what they're an avatar for, which in my mind is an indication that we don't have our focus in the right spot. It's great, to have, respect for someone like a Carl Sagan or a Neil deGrasse Tyson, or any of the science communicators that are much bigger than us in our little corner of the world. But it would be less than ideal if one of them had a big public fall from grace, and many of these folks have, and you go, man, you know what I hate now? Astronomy. Like, I think you can see how that can go, but that has been an unfortunate consequence, is that the fall from grace of some of these people, or their actions in their personal lives, or their public persona, or their personal philosophies, has negatively impacted essentially the science-based approach to doing anything in fitness. And that is, I think that's not a good way to think. It's understandable. It's natural that we kind of elevate people. And I think certain types of people lean into that a lot and like it. And I think that is natural to some degree. And, it's not like if you like being acknowledged by other people, you're automatically a narcissist or a bad person. That's just called being human. But there is a distinction. And this was all just based upon my lived experience, if you will. And I did quote a little bit of psychology. I talked about how why React content does well, because there's a pretty established psychological research that when you critique someone else, even if you give the same objective information, you're rated as more intelligent. I talked about the difference between critical thinking, emotional intelligence, and IQ as elements of intelligence. But what I didn't do was, oh, I don't know, provide research on what type of people become online content creators. And what I didn't do was talk about how being online actually affects you from, say, a quantitative perspective. And what I'm really excited for is to hear about the fact that, is it true, Trex, that there is actually research on these topics?
Indeed. And Helms, I think people have probably picked up on this by now, but you, Helms, are a person who hates science. And so, like, obviously, when you touch on a topic like this, you're going to go right from the hip, just pure vibes, science be damned. And of course, I am going to rein you in and say, no, Helms, without the PubMed link, you are not allowed to have thoughts. You're not allowed to have any kind of perspective about the life that you've lived. We need to stick just to the pages of PubMed. And to be fair, I think a couple of these studies actually are not even indexed in PubMed because they're more in the social sciences rather than the health sciences. So we'll give those a pass because they have a DOI, right? But in any case, yeah, Holmes, it's interesting because your conversation with Steve, unbeknownst to me, was on this topic while I was also kind of ruminating on this topic. And I just went straight to a bunch of meta-analyses because it's one of those things, the same things that you are saying and kind of reiterating are the things that struck me intuitively. And I was like, there has to be some research on this to help us understand basically the exact discrepancy that you highlighted, which is that I interact with fitness people and it's lovely. I go on the internet and I'm like, can we just pull the cord? Like, if I didn't need it to make a living and disseminate research and disseminate educational information, you would not find me on the internet. Like, I would be out. And so I've always been interested by that contrast. And we're finally at a spot where I think we have not just the studies to look into it, but even the meta-analyses to kind of assess why the online space is the way it is and what that means about how we view influencers, how we view even the comment section of posts, how we let that affect us, and how we curate or prune the social media experience that we want to have. And this is not sponsored by any major social media company, but folks, I'm here. Pockets are open, as is my inbox. But Helms, let's start out. We're going to talk a lot about personality research. I think we first need to define what is known as the big five, which in the social sciences, when you're doing personality research, the big five is kind of the personality test that is by far the most common and has a tremendous amount of research behind it. So there are basically 5 traits, and you get scored on these 5 traits. Number 1 is openness to experience, and that refers to how curious, imaginative, and open to new ideas that you are. Another one is conscientiousness, which refers to how organized, responsible, and self-disciplined you are. So folks that are very conscientious tend to be reliable, goal-oriented, good at planning, and they follow through. They tend to like following the rules, and when you tell them to do something, they do it the way that they were supposed to. So people who are really conscientious, like they're like your kind of model student who's very respectful, does what they're supposed to do, does it with high attention to detail, etc. Extroversion is how energized you feel by social interaction. And as a result, a lot of people who are extroverted tend to be pretty out there, pretty in your face, whereas a lot of introverts in many cases will kind of keep to themselves a little bit more. Although there's caveats always. Agreeableness, that's how cooperative and compassionate you are toward others. Neuroticism is the 5th, and that refers to how emotionally reactive and sensitive to stress that you are. So someone low on neuroticism tends to be very calm, emotionally stable, less susceptible to stress. Someone with higher neuroticism is prone to worry, potentially even prone to some mood swings, and then will often experience more self-doubt. Now, something that is not necessarily a component of the Big Five, but something that comes up a lot in personality research is narcissism. And there are 2 types of narcissism that you see talked about in the research. Number 1 is grandiose narcissism. The other is vulnerable narcissism. So grandiose narcissism is someone who has grandiose narcissism tends to be very outwardly confident, very dominant and attention seeking. They'll brag about how superior or how great they are, and they really don't show self-doubt. That's not a level of vulnerability that they will make available to the public. So that's grandiose narcissism. Vulnerable narcissism is very different. These are people who are inwardly quite insecure. They tend to be a little more shy, very defensive, very easily hurt. They often feel unrecognized or underappreciated, and they have a lot of self-doubt, shame, and anxiety. So vulnerable narcissists are not necessarily the people who are way out there in your face telling you how great they are, but they're people who have really heightened sensitivities when they do receive any kind of feedback, correction, etc.
Trex, I think the distinction between narcissistic traits and types of narcissism, and also understanding the big five is really important. And just for those who are not aware, generally when you look at psychology research, they will sometimes talk about states and sometimes they will talk about traits. And the big five is a construct that specifically talks about personality traits, which are generally thought to be pretty stable, not immutable though. And they can be impacted by things that we would put in the bucket of, nature versus nurture. But they're pretty reliable over time. And when people do have a change in what might be described as a trait, it could occur over different stages of life, or potentially due to pretty large impacts in their life, like a head injury or undergoing pretty, massive pharmacological intervention or other things like that. Or it could shift to some degree, but within kind of a relatively similar domain. Like you generally won't see someone going from entirely agreeable to disagreeable, as an example. But anyway, that was great, and carry on. I'm really fascinated by this.
Absolutely, yeah. So now that we have, we've talked a little bit about what the big five are. We talked about grandiose versus vulnerable narcissism, states versus traits. I think we're ready to dive into the actual research here. And so we're just going to give kind of brief takeaways from these studies, but there's some really fascinating work out there. The first study, the study itself is called "Who Wants to Be a YouTuber? Personality Traits Predict the Desire to Become a Social Media Influencer." And I want to say on the front end, obviously, there's no need to paint with too broad a brush here. We're looking at general traits that predict whether someone wants to be a YouTuber. So fitness YouTuber, especially at the top level, there's only a handful of them. So I'm not making this content to just like throw an unsubtle jab at the entire collection of them. But this research was basically trying to figure out the concept, or the hypothesis basically was, there's probably some personality traits that predict not necessarily making it big on YouTube, but just who wants to be out there in front of people, being in this kind of influencer type position. And what they ultimately found, that the key points from the study, there were three main things that gave people a strong motivation to pursue influencer careers. Number one was extroversion, not surprising. Number two was narcissism. They did not delineate between grandiose versus vulnerable, but it was grandiose, like for sure. And then number third was histrionic traits. And that's why I feel so confident saying that it was grandiose narcissism. Histrionic trait, these are people who are, everything is grand, everything is, this huge statement, everything's a spectacle, and they are always at the center of it. So those are the three things in the study that motivated someone to pursue an influencer type career. And there was also a negative association, Helms, with what would compel someone to pursue an influencer career, and that was conscientiousness. And so one of the things, that was kind of the main point of this paper, but one of the things that struck out to me that I'd like to hear your thoughts about is, Helms, if you told me that I needed to produce in a laboratory an excellent scientist, I would say I'm going to turn down the extroversion, I'm going to turn down the narcissism, I'm going to turn down the histrionic traits, and I'm going to increase the conscientiousness. To me, I felt like this was very striking to me, that sometimes, especially in our field,
I have one quibble with that.
Okay, and you're welcome to it, but I think especially in our field, kind of a broader point, I do want to hear your quibble, but a broader point is we often wish for them to be the same thing. Like, I get my science content from this influencer, and I view them as kind of these fairly overlapping personalities and skill sets. And I get my science from YouTube, so I want my YouTuber to be a good scientist. And I would argue that there are probably some less overlapping distributions in terms of the personality types there. But Helms, what is your quibble?
So, I mean, it's field specific. So we are talking about um, human research a lot of the time on people in fitness. So I feel like turning down all of those things and turning up all the others, except for introversion and extroversion, I think would be pretty good. But I find recruitment, keeping participants involved, and obviously, if you're introverted and highly conscientious, a lot of this gets sorted. But sometimes you need to be really on top of communicating with participants in human research, um, especially if it has elements of, well, not always. Actually, I was going to say mixed methods when you do interviews, but actually, if you're too extroverted, you go back and you listen to your thing and you're like, wow, that was supposed to be an interview, but I was sure as hell talking a lot for that person. But anyway, I think I would say for quantitative training studies, nutrition studies, and when you need to like cast a wide net, get a lot of people, especially in our field that struggles with participation rates and low N, I think extroversion is actually pretty helpful. And the last thing I would say is that, in my experience, if you are a lower capability in terms of intelligence, critical thinking, but you are extroverted and don't have a strong ego, you're actually more likely to succeed in a PhD than if you are introverted but have higher capability, because you're more likely to reinvent the wheel. You won't ask for help. You'll try to do it all yourself. You'll suffer in silence. And honestly, resourcefulness is one thing, but if you are, and critical thinking is one thing, but if you are not willing to go out there, expose your ignorance, and ask for help, you're much more likely to fail a PhD because you're used to the whole journey through the master's degree of much smaller tasks that you can just do on your own and not have to worry about others and all that stuff. And you're probably the person who got like burned in high school for those group projects where you ended up doing all the work and you held the bag. So I identified that very early on as a supervisor. When I have introverted, highly intelligent students, I'm like, okay, this one's actually at risk, even though they could be a top scientist. So very minor quibbles, like I said, but important context just to understand the field. And I will shut up.
No, those are totally fair. And of course, we're painting with broad brushes here because everyone's got their own little unique combination of these traits. They make them work. These are all spectra. You fall somewhere in them. But I would say another fair quibble, Helms, is that there's a big difference between being an excellent scientific thinker and a star scientist. And I would actually say that the same thing that makes someone a good YouTuber probably also makes them a star scientist, especially in fields where like legitimate model and theory building is not necessary. And it's more just you are a scientist, brand yourself as a scientist. And we see a lot of that, man. Like there's a lot of fields where your ability to go and, be the star of the show and get the, do the right amount of networking to get on the right lists and the right award things and in the the right grant reviews, and there's a lot of this that, I mean, and so that's like you were saying, Helms, the kind of traits you talked about. I think, not to get on a huge tangent that's not interesting to the audience at all, but there's a big difference between succeeding in science and like what I'm referring to, which is like a careful scientific thinker. So like the extroversion, is that does that help you run studies really well? Yes, but in a lot of fields of science, it's not particularly relevant. And even at like the high level human trial level, you're probably hiring study coordinators, and that's something that you're looking for. So all that is to say,
All
I
right. Well, let me ask you a question.
okay.
Where do you see extroversion as a disadvantage and introversion as an advantage? Because I can
No, no, no.
space
I'm
for
not.
openness.
No,
You
no,
said
no.
you want to dial it down.
I no. I said when I think of. Okay, so in my mind, not to say that once you reach a certain level of extroversion, you can't be a good scientist. And in fact, I conceded. I actually think it's a strong trait for your brand building as a scientist and for networking. So I'm not saying that it precludes you. It's just my kind of mental model of the kind of I'm going to retreat and work on, understanding this theory and kind of huddle up in my little scientific bubble. It just strikes me as that is one archetype of the kind of scientist who secludes themselves away to busy themselves with their work. So I'm not saying that it is that's not the one. If you look at the outline helms, that is bolded. For me, it's the narcissism and the histrionic traits that I think are particularly antithetical to being a careful communicator of science.
That's fair. And I'm just in defense of my fellow, probably more on the extroverted scale. Not that I am actually an extreme extrovert by any means. I would just say the conscientiousness measures self-control, diligence, attention to detail.
Yeah.
And openness measures, curiosity and willingness to entertain new ideas. Extroversion is social interactivity,
Yeah.
boldness, quote unquote energy. And neuroticism, can also drive more attention to detail as well, because you have a proneness to anxiety and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
I would just put forth that introversion and extroversion is probably neutral as far as your ability to be a scientist, independent of
yes.
brand.
And again, we're talking ability versus Eric's little mental model, which is biased because he's extremely introverted. And I find that when I'm out,
Extroverted.
no, I'm introverted.
Oh, sorry. When you said Eric, I didn't know you were referring to.
No, I'm talking to me.
Got it.
Yeah, there's Eric and then there's Helms. But I always speak in the third person. You know this. And so whenever I probably what's coloring my bias here is that when I'm out actually engaging with people, I'm thinking in my brain, I should be at home working because first of all, I'm behind on things. And second of all, wouldn't that be lovely to be to be home alone? But anyway, so the big point here is when they look at aspiring influencers and say, the folks who really want to get into this stuff, what are some of the key traits that jump out? The big ones that are kind of circled: narcissism, histrionic traits, and low conscientiousness, which not necessarily ideal, especially when it comes to, as we said, science communication, and very careful, deliberate, even-handed. The content is in charge, not me. Not an ideal mix. Now, when we look at the idea of social media use, this is a different study looking at narcissism and social media use. There's been research showing a positive link between grandiose narcissism and social media activity. And when we say activity, we mean posting as an activity, number of followers as a proxy for activity, and frequency of posting selfies as a third kind of branch of activity. And so generally speaking, we see that when we look at the influencers who are kind of holding court in the social media public square, again, we see a lot of narcissism, histrionic traits, low conscientiousness. When we see a lot of power users who are doing a lot of the engagement that drives algorithmic function, as far as I understand, I'm no expert in social media algorithms, but I've been led to believe that, engagement is really what drives the ship. We start to see a lot of grandiose narcissism in terms of what you are seeing as the follower, viewer, passive participant when you open up social media. There's another study that specifically looked at sharing. I think they might have included posting as part of sharing. They said sharers of content on social media. But they were looking at traits of posters / sharers, and they were specifically looking at those big 5 traits. They found that agreeableness and conscientiousness were actually negatively associated with sharing behavior. So understandably, extroversion was positively correlated with sharing and engagement. So that makes sense. Even in the digital space, extroverts are just a little bit more out there, more of a poster than a lurker. But the thing that was really interesting to me was when we look at things that were negatively associated with sharing, again, the 2 that stuck out were agreeableness and conscientiousness. And so one one thing that obviously is not great about that is when you are opening up social media, you are finding a lot of engagement being driven by people who are by based on their personality traits very unlikely to be agreeable in nature. And so like a lot of people, they get really, they turn against social media because they're like, I feel like everything is a big fight. And so that may not necessarily just be your personal curated algorithm. It may not be that you're hypersensitive to it. It does seem to be that you have a lot of extroverted, disagreeable people who are kind of power users on social media who are kind of hashing it out and kind of fighting through things. And then again, conscientiousness, ideally, especially when we are talking about a when we're talking about a field where generally in health and fitness, science communication, we're really hoping that people are very deliberate and organized with their argument and kind of, very, very thoughtful about getting it right and being detailed and unbiased and, a fairly, we want their posts to be really like buttoned up and communicate things effectively. And so we kind of have this negative combination, in my opinion, of low agreeableness, low conscientiousness being the power posters, which is not exactly ideal for cultivating a pleasant and rigorously accurate kind of environment of content. And then the final piece of research I want to mention here is that there is some research looking at how social media use can temporarily actually change your personality states. So like you brought up, Helms, the difference between a trait and a state. So states are things that are much more malleable in the short term. So there's a study that looked at how Instagram specifically, how using it impacted acute measures of the big five personality traits, in addition to another metric that I'll talk about. But the key finding that they identified, there are two things that stuck out. In terms of the big five, they found that people who spent more time on Instagram had acutely had higher neuroticism states immediately after they were put on the platform. And they also mentioned that these individuals had a higher need for uniqueness. And so that's not a big five trait, but it's really interesting. I ended up doing a lot of Googling, and I was like, kind of getting to the bottom of what would be the consequences of this kind of combined duo of heightened neuroticism, and also heightened need for uniqueness. And it sounds like it kind of puts you into this kind of double whammy situation where, because of the heightened neuroticism, you're likely to feel a lot more insecurity. And because of that increase, what they call need for uniqueness, generally that tends to make you more motivated to differentiate yourself. And so one of the things that comes up a lot when people talk about social media is performative behavior. And what you tend to find is when you have a higher need for uniqueness, you have two things that result from that. Number one, really hot takes that go against the grain and tend to be extremely disagreeable and often controversial. And number two, a lot of performative behavior where it's not enough to be different. You feel an increased desire to signal to everyone that you are not in the mainstream on this. You have a unique take. And so when we talk about really high polarization in social media spaces, it's like you have this hyper anxious state that you're entering when you're on it, and you say, okay, I need to differentiate myself. And ultimately there's a lot going on that might make you more inclined to make a really hot take that is particularly controversial, particularly disagreeable, and then you have you double down on the strength of it to differentiate yourself and say, this is my thing. I'm way out here in this camp, and you're in the middle with all the normies, and that's really not good for you. And so there's a lot of this othering after someone kind of performs a particular camp that they find themselves in. So Helms, that is my ultra quick rundown of some of the research that I've been ruminating in and steeping in. And so I'm a little bit curious as to, does that general milieu of when we look at influencers, power posters, engagers, and then the use, or what happens to users when they kind of log in, does that seem to match your experience of many of the frustrations or pain points with social media?
100%. And you probably saw some of my facial expressions and responses. You were talking about this, and it was like, God, that makes so much sense. The interesting thing is, it also, I felt very I don't know if seen is the right word, but I'm like, that's why I have this love-hate relationship with social media. Not because I have to do it because of yes, we both have to engage with it because we have decided to be science communicators, and not engaging with social media and calling yourself a science communicator is like saying I'm a race car driver. Oh, well, how can I get a driver's license or get in a car? I just like the theoretical idea of driving cars, and I study racetracks or whatever, you know?
Yeah.
So when I look at, I don't think I've actually taken the big five, but I've taken the TCI, which has, it's another personality inventory, has a lot of crossover, and they're both pretty highly reliable and valid for measuring personality traits. And I think if I remember what I got on the TCI and how they overlap, I'm reasonably high in extroversion, very high in agreeableness, and also quite high in conscientiousness and very high in openness. So like I'm on social media and then I hate it. You know, like it's
Yeah.
like when you think about like all those things. So it's no, it doesn't surprise me at all, but it is very much like, oh, like I see the puzzle pieces fitting. So no, I think that was a really awesome summary. And I'm sure there was a few people just laughing at what their experiences are. And I hope some people understand the implications of what this means is that we're not getting an unbiased representation of the supposed community that the online fitness space represents.
Absolutely. And one of the things that got me really fascinated by like one of the reasons I started digging into this research, and as you can probably tell, dear listener, I mean, this is a work in progress. I'm just kind of bathing in this work and like I'm still ruminating on how to fit all the pieces together fully. But I reached a point where I realized like the last like three times that someone had like that I'd gotten a big influx of like comments to me or like DMs of like, hey, what do you think about this? Had literally zero to do with science, fitness, lifting, exercising, nutrition. It was pure personalities. It was, what do you think about this influencer who did this? And it's all over the place. And it started to make me think like, my answer to all three of them was, well, that's not true. My answers varied depending on the severity of the misdeed and the headlines and things like that. But it made me really kind of realize for a second, like, so much of the online fitness industry discourse has nothing to do with fitness. Like, fitness is just kind of a backdrop upon which we engage in this kind of like narcissistic celebrity character promotion versus character assassination versus, there's a lot of character driven story building here and not a whole lot of plot if you start to just kind of do a superficial scan of what's going on out there. And then when you dive into the little corners where people actually are talking about, I don't know, lifting, evidence related to lifting or nutrition, you start to see a lot of really antagonistic back and forth where you're like, oh, this is not my experience when I talk to people in real life about lifting, when we're talking shop. And you start to think through, okay, well, this whole like character driven story instead of plot driven story, it's because we have a lot of grandiose narcissists who are kind of holding court and running the show. And then on the periphery of it, we have the power posters who tend to be very, very low on agreeableness, who are really, really interested in arguing with everybody. The conscientiousness isn't low, which is why you're looking at a lot of the arguments that go together and you're like, what is even happening here? This is kind of a mess. And so another thing that didn't come up a lot is we're not seeing a whole lot of openness in the power sharers or the posters or the influencers. And so we have a lot of disagreeable folks who are very much about them, not about the information, who are dug in on their talking points, and they will fight it to the death, not as a chore, but because they love it. Like they really do enjoy it. So my big takeaway here for people is when you go on the internet and you're just like, this seems terrible, I have less faith in humanity, I'm having a very bad time, and if this is fitness, I don't know if I even like it. I want to just reassure everybody that what you are looking at is such a weird little distorted, not even a snapshot. It's a fabrication built upon the concept of fitness. You are getting this very, very tiny subset of individuals who are not remotely representative of fitness, who are absolutely dominating the discourse. And because of their personality traits, they are engaging in all of the rage and anger and divisiveness that ultimately drives engagement, which drives algorithmic selection as far as I can tell. And so it's not just a top-down thing. It's a top-level narcissism, middle-level disagreeableness, and zealous enthusiasm about arguing and fighting, and then algorithmic layers that find all that arguing and fighting and say, oh my God, that picture has 700 comments. Clearly, this is what the people want. So you are really marinating in a stew of really unfavorable personality trait driven stuff, which is also tapping into temporary changes in your states when your personality states when you are actually on social media. And it's creating that perfect storm, which, Helms, I'm sure you felt this. There have been days where I open up social media for the first time. It's been like 4 minutes and I'm just like, nope, not today. I shut it. I'm like, I need to take a shower. That was all a mess. I'm rethinking my entire life. And so when you are on the internet, Helms, let me know if you agree with my conclusions here. But my plea to listeners is, number one, when we look at this information, when you're evaluating the influencers you follow and your sources of information, this is a place, Helms, we talk about this all the time with interpreting science, where we say to be skeptical, not cynical. This is the one spot where I think tiptoeing up to that line of cynicism actually kind of makes sense. And the reason I say that is, if you're not careful, like if you don't really ramp up your skepticism close to that line, you will get got by influencers who are, listen, narcissism is a trait. It's a spectrum, right? We all got a bit of it to some extent. But there are some like pathological narcissists who get on the internet, they cultivate these very performative personalities. They lean into that. They try to nurture these parasocial friendships by which you worship them. And then they absolutely prey on that. And we've seen at least one cancellation in the last couple of weeks that fits that to an absolute T. And so this is one of those, the Helms, let me know how much you disagree, but I actually think flirting with that line of cynicism, when you're really trying to assess somebody and being like, am I going to put a meaningful amount of trust in them and invest in this one-way parasocial relationship? That's a case where I think a little bit of cynicism actually might even be warranted.
So I agree with nuance. Who knew, right?
Yeah.
And this is obviously my conscientiousness trait shining through. First off, it is not in your heart of hearts where you're actually thinking and where your suspicions and your concerns are, and maybe where your guard is up, a bad thing to have a default setting that you could describe as cynical of, if I am interacting with an online personality or someone we would describe as an influencer or a prolific poster. I think there's a difference between having an online presence and someone being perpetually online as well.
Yeah.
Like, I think we can both see the primary social media strategy that Trex has is hitting accept on collaborations and repost when he's in stories. And I am definitely more than that. But if you look at the proportion of the posts on my feed which are collaborations, it's pretty high.
Yeah.
You know? Some of that is just time. Like, you cannot be the co-director of a research institute, have PhD students, be training as much as I do and all the other things I do, and be online. But it also shows you where my priorities are. Like, how much time do I want to be spent seen? And also, what do I share online? People have rarely seen my wife or my cats, even though they see my naked body a lot. But honestly, if I decided that the flavor of Iron Game I liked was powerlifting, it would almost be never, right? Anyway, so the default setting, nothing wrong with being a little cynical and assuming this is probably not a good person. But I do think the best way to get to the truth and to ensure that everyone, not just the person you're interacting with, and I've talked about this before, gets there, is still operating with the principle of charity. So think inside, this person is potentially a narcissist, maybe even probably, if they have a huge following and are perpetually online, and it does always seem to be about them, even if they're evidence-based, because they are absolutely not mutually exclusive. That's what the young, naive Eric Helms learned. And still operate from a place of the principle of charity, even if you don't even necessarily believe yourself, because that ultimately, steel manning things is how you build critical thinking.
Yeah.
And you mentioned tiptoeing up to the line of cynicism. I will just make the final conscientious distinction that is maybe perhaps a little disagreeable, that cynicism and skepticism are not a spectrum, but they are actually two different things. And now I have...
So elaborate on that.
All over
How would you...
Okay.
Yeah.
So skepticism is much more directed towards ideas. This is your disposition towards ideas, right? and how you think, while cynicism is how you parse information through the lens of the person telling it, and that you will have a preference or even a disposition towards um, devaluing information or valuing information based upon who says it. And you tend to go with more of a knee-jerk, impulsive way of thinking. And that's actually more critical thinking, or low critical thinking, I should say, which co-varies with cynicism. So you're the, I guess cynicism, you're more likely to go, this person's an idiot, so anything they've said is wrong, regardless of who else says it,
Yeah.
right? I think being cynical about someone's intentions, and maybe how altruistic they are, just needs to be separated from, how do I address the claims they make?
Yes.
You can be skeptical about and be agnostic about the person they are. And we
Yeah.
struggle with that as society, right? Like, how do I separate the music from the artist, or
Yeah.
the content from the influencer, etc.?
Yeah. So,
And
yeah.
invariably, I will just say, this is a point of contention that often happens when we see a quote unquote evidence based influencer have a fall from grace, due to some type of ethical controversy, or them displaying themselves to have views, political or otherwise, or just be a shitty person. And then you're like, well, what do I do with this? Because maybe some of their content was factually correct or helpful, but I really wish they didn't exist, or I don't want to follow them, or I don't want to support them. And you see a lot of tension in our community like that. Less of an issue when people are just selling fit teas, and like nobody cares about, some of the more egregious content out there, because it was bad from the start. And it's like, oh, now their personality actually seems to match their content. It's shitty in both cases. So anyway.
Yeah. No, so yeah, in an ideal world, I think you would, when exploring ideas or assessing ideas, you'd have a relatively stable and relatively high level of skepticism through which you're kind of viewing and critically assessing content. Um, but when it comes to, I think for this, when it comes to discussion of social media, there's definitely two routes people go, right? One is, you're going to follow me because I am your friend. I'm a source of stability in your life. It makes you feel warm and tingly to enjoy my content. You believe that we have this parasocial relationship that I nurture. And then other folks are out there who are like, hey, there's a new meta-analysis on reps in reserve and how close to failure you should get, right? Like, they're very, very different branches. And what I'm speaking to more is just to be wary of where you place your emotional trust on the internet. Because it seems to me, especially in the last couple of weeks, there are a lot of people who, even more than they acutely noticed, they were really kind of emotionally out on a ledge in some vulnerable kind of like I've seen a lot of people who seem to feel really, really just sad and let down when a person has that fall from grace. And so my big thing is kind of helping people see that, like, you should, not to be like, again, like ultra cynical, but like, if we're just going to play the numbers and you decide to be like a devoted, emotionally involved follower of 100 of individuals who fall in this camp, like, a massive proportion of them are going to let you down. And so it's better to know that on the front end and kind of have your guard up a little bit, just so that you can be a more savvy online person, a person who uses the internet in a way that's a little bit more informed, with knowledge of what kind of personality types are drawn to trying to produce and cultivate and foster those types of parasocial relationships. Now, I think we covered some of the big stuff, right? Which is, you know, keep your guard up a little bit before you get too emotionally attached to an influencer, knowing what we know. Try not to get too dejected about the state of fitness based on the online discourse, because knowing what we know based on this research, it is not remotely reminiscent of what fitness actually looks like in practice. It is this weird, like I said, a fabrication built upon the premise of fitness that all these arguments are happening and there's so much negativity. Have faith that the actual fitness community out there is actually like very supportive and very cool. And you may have to think about how to go out and find that. And it may be in person. It may be back in the day, forums were not perfect, but they were a lot better than what we have now. So maybe a return to the forum structure would be a lot of fun. But I think it's worth thinking, above all else, thinking very critically about where you get your information from, where you place your trust online, what your expectations are for how that trust is placed. And then finally, my biggest point is encouraging people to cultivate their social media life very deliberately. Um, I think it's kind of, I don't think it's very helpful to say like you should do less or do more or be, go cold turkey and just abstain from social media. It is reasonably woven into the fabric of life at this point to some extent. And so rather than taking an absolute stance of being like, hey, you should fully abstain or be like chronically pathologically online, um, the other approach is to cultivate and kind of prune your social media experience very deliberately. And so, like, it's weird. I've seen a lot of people who are arguing online. Big surprise. It makes it into my algorithm. And they treat like blocking or muting accounts as if it's some kind of emotionally fragile thing to do. Like it is almost a negative stain on your reputation if you have blocked people. First of all, I think that's insane. I think that's completely silly and nonsensical. The block on social media is your tool to say, when I see all this incessant nonsense that makes me feel worse after viewing it, I don't have to subject myself to that. And I don't care what your algorithm thinks. I choose what's going to be here. And if you commit to actually taking proactive steps towards saying, this account is just a magnet for negativity, I don't want it. This person is just an absolutely insufferable narcissist, and I'm not interested. This person is performing empathy to cultivate what is essentially a cult of personality so they can sell t-shirts. I don't want to see that because that lack of sincerity and ingenuine behavior drives me nuts. You have the power to do that. And frankly, I think it's actually a very noble thing when someone says, even though I know what happens to my my personality states or what happens to the average person's personality states, I'm going to try to kind of buffer some level of stoicism, put on the hazmat suit, get into my social media feed and say, not today, Satan. I'm blocking this. I'm not going to let this bother me today. I just think that people will have a much better time and, Helms, find their way to better information. If there's a big account that's clouding up your feed or your homepage or whatever platform you're on, and you're just like, this gets shared by everybody, it's all over the place, the algorithm clearly favors it, I get nothing out of this, and I wish I got more of the good stuff, that alone is a reason to actually block an account and just say anything to do with this creator, it's never good. It's never interesting. It's never even if you don't hate them, even if you're just like, I just find them boring and completely unhelpful, block them. It will put you on a track toward actually getting the stuff you want. So Helms, I think that's kind of my biggest takeaway is not to produce the next generation of hyper cynical haters. It's not to falsely assert that there's some spectrum containing both skepticism and cynicism as two stops on a same spectrum. It's not to try to shame you for being an extrovert, because absolutely extroversion is a wonderful flavor of personality. It's one I don't personally possess, but I want to be very clear that extroversion is not a negative personality trait, nor does it preclude someone from being a great scientist. In many cases, helps them be a better scientist in practice. But that's all of my caveats and clarifications and apologies, and also my key takeaway.
I think that was an excellent summary. And as an extroverted narcissist, I, of course, took it personally when you dared suggest that a good scientist would want to turn down that trait. So no, we're good now because I am at the center of all things. No, in all seriousness, I think you did a really good job with that. And I think as much of this is kind of like an indictment of most of the online space that we interact with, honestly, not just in the fitness field, this is across anything, right? I think it's also probably a hopeful reminder to people. Would you agree with that, Trex? Like, hey, this is not representative.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I will just also totally big up you and say, being willing to block people, I think, is really, really important. The part of me that has openness and also could be perceived because I'm an online science communicator, that when I block someone, that can be used against me to say I'm not willing to have open dialogue. That does create some tension for me. Like there was a specific researcher who I think scores probably pretty low on agreeableness, but does argue in good faith. But I felt misrepresented by the person, and I restricted them. I didn't even block, and they noticed it, and then publicly posted about it immediately, and then tried to frame it as I am unwilling to just discuss things. And I had to, okay, now I've got to contact this person, unrestrict them, but ultimately I just needed to reduce that emotional stress so that I could focus on doing my job and engage with people who were probably a little higher on the agreeableness and open conversations, because constantly responding to my phone in the kind of obsessive way that I tend to, because I need to finish tasks before I can let go of them with my own brand of brain, uh, wasn't working well. But I'm not allowed to, because it makes me look like I'm not actually practicing what I preach. So it is, there's tension there if you are trying to be online and actually engage with people versus just kind of post and forget it, which I trend towards just for my own sanity. Because if I post and engage, knowing that I'm going to be engaging with people who are high disagreeable, even when they're like good folks, because that's I think that's a really common thing too. It's like there are plenty of grandiose narcissists online, but there are also plenty of frankly good people who are just disagreeable.
Yeah.
Like they like debating, they want to figure out what the holes in your argument are, and those people are awesome in small doses at the right times. And if you're not an obsessive personality yourself who has to go down the rabbit hole with them, and I get very frustrated when I feel like against my will, I'm being pulled into a huge time suck. And I'm like, okay, you're disagreeable and you have far more time on your hands than I do. And you're not really respecting what you're asking me to do implicitly. And I think that creates some tension for me. I don't know if you ever experienced that.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's the thing is that my whole thing is like being open means, in my view, in this context we're talking about, means being open to ideas, right?
Yes.
It does not mean my front door is open and you get to come take a shit in my living room and I have to deal with it. And when someone is like bothering me online, you might as well be walking in my front door and taking a shit in my living room. You're bothering me. And you're not entitled to the right to bother me whenever you like. And so to me, that's the big difference. And so I would say if you have this grand scientific idea, there's a modality for that communication of ideas. We call it academic publishing. Write your article up. If it's this beautiful grand theory, publish it. I'll critique it in various forms of publishing. That's how this works. It's how it's worked for many, many, many decades, a couple centuries, depending on what field you're talking about. So, no, I totally agree. I know a lot of people say that's a bad look. And to me, that's the big distinction that I would defend myself with, which is basically social media is different because when I'm eating dinner, my phone buzzes. So you're not entitled to that. You're entitled to having your opinion. You're entitled to me not attacking you personally over that opinion. I'm going to review your opinion if you present it in a meaningful, substantive way, but you don't get unlimited vouchers to just take my time and attention, especially, again, like you said, there's even like very good people who are just disagreeable and they enjoy the sport of kind of sparring and tweaking with the ideas and things. And again, as a very busy person, I can't participate in that, even if I wanted to. And then as a person who I think would be very high in agreeableness, I think it stresses me out when I engage with people that are highly disagreeable, because I think agreeable people kind of have this natural bias. We want to work toward, okay, let's get to the agreeable part where we meet in the middle, shake hands and say, good day to you, agree to disagree, or we agree on this 40%, disagree on the other 60%, appreciate you, thanks for stopping by, I'm going to go eat dinner. And I think when it's an agreeable person and a disagreeable person, I think it really stresses out the agreeable person. At least that's been my experience. So that's another instance where I wouldn't just block someone who's a good person and disagreeable. I would just say, hey, I love you, appreciate you, but this is not working for me. So like, I'm not going to
100%.
block you, but I can't keep doing this with you. But like, if someone is like being very inflammatory, if they just have a personality, approach that I just can't stand on the internet, I'm more inclined to just say, hey, I'll read your paper if you publish it, but until then, no thanks, I'm out.
No, that's perfectly well said. And I think that was the only little bit of nuance that I wanted to share, which is more of, understanding the personal struggles and these different types of personalities and not mistaking one for the other. But no, I think you've done a master class on helping people understand why online fitness sucks, but that it doesn't really represent the reality of the space that we operate in, and why I think it's really important to sometimes actually go to in-person events,
Yeah.
as much as, your one's introversion or extroversion can handle it, because it's a really nice reminder. And post-COVID, once the economy picked back up, I was like, oh yeah, I actually do like these, so.
Yeah. No, and even as an introvert, I like going to in-person events that are fitness or science related because it does kind of remind me like the in-person experience is so much better than the online experience, just the interactions. So yeah, like you said, Helms, if you feel like, man, online fitness really sucks, yes, but the final thing I'll reiterate is it doesn't have to. Like you don't get to like rewrite the entire, you don't get to reset the entire tenor of the online discourse, but you do have tools at your disposal to eliminate the stuff that really bothers you and gets under your skin. And there's nothing weak about doing that. It's just like,
Hmm.
to what extent do you want your online life to be dictated by annoying people that you could easily rectify that? Like it's just it's nonsensical to say like, well, I guess I have to hate going on Instagram because of these four individuals who are dominating the conversation. It's like, dude, just fix it. Like you're allowed to, and you will have a much better time.
Well said.
All right, Helms, I think that does it for tonight. As always, thanks to everyone for joining us. If you have any negative comments, send those to Helms. He's more extroverted. He's more prepared to encounter those. Like we always say, be sure to support our friends at Elite FTS with the code MRR10 for a 10% discount over at EliteFTS.com. And if you want to support us, the way to do that, the best way to do that, of course, is by becoming a member of the MASS community. Learn more at massresearchreview.com. Helms, anything to say to the good people before we go?
No, just thank you so much. We're glad to have you here. And yeah, we've got some awesome stuff coming in the current year, not the new year, to be clear, now that we're on the other side of January.
Yeah, so folks, all that stuff I said today doesn't apply to us. We love you. We have a very close relationship that goes both directions, and I want to nurture that and utilize your trust as an asset in my back pocket as a mega influencer in the fitness industry. So forget all that stuff I said earlier. You can trust me implicitly. I'll never let you down. Same things with Helms. And we will be back that's one commitment that we will not let you down on. We will be back in a week. So we'll see you, I believe, Tuesday night of next week. Everybody take care.